Tonight on Nation to Nation, remember the recognition of Indigenous rights framework? It's far from dead, says the Trudeau government.
We have a number of tables where recognition of rights is being discussed and coming forward.
And there's a familiar face looking to play a part. Jody Wilson-Raybould says she knows what needs to happen.
And I'll tell you, I'm going to be releasing some documentation for consideration as part of this necessary dialogue.
Senator Kim Pate says mandatory minimum sentencing is keeping Indigenous people behind bars. She introduced a new bill to help undo that.
There's no excuse to not implement this and allow judges discretion to not impose mandatory minimum penalties.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamran and welcome to Nation. Ottawa has a bit more buzz this week now that Parliament is back in session. Long gone is the Prime Minister's majority after the last federal election, so as everyone gets back to business, we're looking at what's to come. There's one popular face, but not in a familiar place. Jody Wilson-Raybould was kicked out of the Liberal caucus last year after the SNC-Lavalin scandal. She then ran as an independent in the last fall's election and won. But her seat comes with much less power than the previous one she held. So to talk about all that, I'm now joined by Ms. Wilson-Raybould. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Todd. Happy to be here.
What do you hope to accomplish as an independent who was formerly Justice Minister and Attorney General?
Well, I mean, I have to say I am incredibly happy and honored to have been elected as the first female independent member of Parliament, elected by the people of Vancouver-Granville. I am going to continue to represent my constituents and the issues that are important to them, which are the issues that are important to me. You know, tackling, taking ambitious steps to do our part in tackling climate change. Indigenous reconciliation certainly is something that was top of mind when I decided to run to be an MP. Issues around democratic reform and affordability are what I heard and what sent me to Ottawa.
Of course, a week ago you asked the Trudeau government when it would repeal mandatory minimums during question period. How happy were you with that answer?
Well, I've come to learn, and I mean, I think question period is an important hour of our day. However, you don't necessarily get the answers that you're looking for. I mean, another thing that I want to continue to work on is having and creating broad reforms to the criminal justice system. I didn't hear that the government was going to change the criminal code with respect to sentencing, mandatory minimum penalties, but what I do know, knew when I was the Justice Minister and advocated for change prior to becoming Justice Minister, is that mandatory minimum penalties in the criminal code contribute significantly to the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples, Black Canadians, and other marginalized people in the criminal justice system. And you know, the time for action based on political expediency or inaction because of political expediency, it just has to change, and it's evidenced in the correctional investigators report that came out a number of weeks ago.
Speaking of your time as Justice Minister, one of the areas you wanted changed was how traditional laws were recognized by the federal government. What were you trying to accomplish before you were shuffled out?
Well, I believe, and I have always believed, in having worked with Indigenous communities, including my own, my entire life, that we need to ensure we transform the relationship between Indigenous governments, Indigenous communities, and Crown governments. And that requires ensuring that we're coming together to form new relationships that are based on rights recognition and fully create the space for Indigenous nations to rebuild and to reconcile their hereditary systems or traditional systems into the modern world. And that would be and will be at the pace and the speed and the direction of Indigenous communities. The federal government needs to ensure that Indigenous peoples take their place, or can take their place, and create mechanisms for real reconciliation, true reconciliation, based on the fact that Indigenous peoples have the inherent right to self-determination, to self-government, and that is amplified greatly and importantly so in documents like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There's a long way to go. I was hopeful that in the previous government we would have taken that step to create the space for transformative change. But as an independent member of Parliament working across party lines, I'm going to continue to put as much pressure as I can on this government and work with Indigenous peoples across the country to do what's right.
It sounds like what you're talking about is a kind of a piece of unfinished business for you, and that was the implementation of an Indigenous rights framework. Am I correct in that?
Absolutely, and I still believe fundamentally that ensuring there is a recognition and implementation of rights framework in this country, which embraces and legislates the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into law, but not only takes that necessary step, takes the step to require the federal government to change its laws, to change its policies and its operational practices to, as I said, create the space for Indigenous nations in this country to rebuild based on their culture, their traditions, based on Indigenous laws, which are increasingly forming the basis for discussions and decisions that courts are bringing forward and making. It's incredibly important, and it is unfinished business, as you say, that needs to happen in order for our country to move forward and to be even better, because Indigenous nations right across the country can see themselves in the Constitution, and that hasn't happened yet, and it's an incredible opportunity, and it's been a missed opportunity, and it needs to change.
Do you think that opportunity wouldn't have been missed if you'd been allowed to write it yourself instead of, I know there was a fundamental disagreement between you and Crown Indigenous Relations Carolyn Bennett. She wanted to consult more broadly, and you wanted to write it yourself. So would that have happened quicker if you'd been allowed to do that?
Well, I wish and know that we could have created that rights recognition framework early on in the last government. And certainly I embrace the ability to write such a document, to participate in drafting legislation that will create that space. But that's not simply me. That is a reflection of decades and generations of Indigenous peoples who have been advocating for rights recognition, for other governments to embrace the inherent right of self-government. That's what's going to write the legislation and write the pages as we turn this chapter in our history. And again, I've benefited from all of those years of knowledge from our elders and from our leaders, and I have and will continue to ensure that I provide those documents, that I inject some documents into the discussion around what a rights recognition framework will look like. I am planning on traveling across the country to give some speeches and to engage in questions and answers and to work on this so we can continue to have the necessary conversations. And I'll tell you, I'm going to be releasing some documentation for consideration as part of this necessary dialogue in the near future. And I'm hopeful that Indigenous peoples right across the country, and equally as importantly, Canadians, start or continue to have this necessary conversation, and that we make some broad sweeping changes to enable our nations to rebuild.
Would it be fair to say that Minister Bennett took the right course, because a lot of people were, Indigenous leaders were surprised by how quickly this could be rolled out, and they call it the White Paper 2.0. Do you think that being a little more cautious was the right way to go?
Well, I've always been one to ensure, or to want to ensure, that we hear from all voices. I believe fundamentally in consensus building and consensus-based decision making. That's who I am. That's how I was raised in the laws of our big house. I do, however, know what Indigenous peoples have been asking for generations, and that is to have true recognition of their rights, recognition of Aboriginal title and rights, and how a government, another government, whether that be federally or a provincial government, moves towards that by creating legislation and creating different tools and pathways for Indigenous peoples to rebuild their nations, is not something that is up for consideration. It's beyond dispute. Indigenous peoples have the right to self-government, to self-determine for themselves how their nation and their communities move forward. We need to create that space, and that's the first step. Legislating the United Nations Declaration and creating legislation that ensures that the federal government will have to change its laws and policies. That's the first step. The second step and the third and beyond, those steps are the incredibly hard ones that Indigenous peoples will take to rebuild their institutions of government, to ensure rightfully that they have a role to play in decisions around resource development, for example, on their traditional territories. We're seeing that across the country. We're seeing that specifically in British Columbia right now. We need to ensure that as a government, Parliament provides Indigenous nations with the ability, if you're First Nations, to move beyond the Indian Act and to rebuild your institutions of government, to ensure that you can make decisions for your community, for your territory, to ensure that it's enduring and lives on into the future.
Ms. Wilson-Raybould, thank you for spending some time to talk to me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
After the break, the Parliamentary Secretaries for Indigenous Services and Crown Indigenous Relations drop by. Welcome back. You sometimes see them answering questions for their ministers during question period. They occasionally attend events, announcements, and ceremonies, and in the past they usually represent the government side during our political panel of MPs. I'm talking about the Parliamentary Secretaries for Indigenous Services and Crown Indigenous Relations. But what exactly is their role in government and cabinet? To answer that and discuss other things, I'm now joined by two relatively new secretaries, Pam Demov for Indigenous Services and Gary Anna Desangari for Crown Indigenous Relations. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Glad to be here.
Ms. Demov, I'll start with you. What exactly do you do?
I do lots, Todd. I was really excited when I got the call from the Prime Minister to be Parliamentary Secretary for Indigenous Services. I'd been Parliamentary Secretary for Health, and you described it really well, assisting the Minister in appearing at events, but really probably the most important thing that we do is assist the Minister in delivering on in my case, his mandate letter. So, we can be a liaison between caucus and cabinet, assist our caucus members with information that they might need, if they have issues they want to bring forward, and not just our caucus, but often it's members of the other side as well, other parties.
Mr. Anand Desangari, how do you get picked for the role? Is it just the Prime Minister calls you up and say, hey?
I can't really say. I think there's probably a number of reasons, considerations that go into it. I was Parliamentary Secretary last year for Heritage and Multiculturalism, so I was part of bringing forward the anti-racism initiatives, as well as C91, an act with respect to Indigenous languages. And I was on the committee for my first 3 years in office. So I have worked extensively on a number of issues, particularly languages, as well as UNDRIP with former MP Romeo Saganash, and I was very excited again, like Pam, to be asked to do this role. It is, my opinion, the most important role that we have to ensure that this relationship and going forward, Canada's set on the right path. So I think we're both excited. I know it's an incredible honor, but it's also a huge responsibility to ensure that we move forward in the right direction.
I want to talk a bit about your department, which is Indigenous Services now. Probably most contentious issue right now is the rollout of child welfare, how Bill C-92 was rolled out, and also the issue that's come out recently that the NDP have certainly brought up in the House, and that's how much money has been spent litigating the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. So I guess, what would you say to our audience about this? There's been a lot of promises, but I think some people feel that they might have been broken.
Well, so those are two issues. So I'll start first with child welfare, Bill C-92, which we passed in the last Parliament, as you know. In order to roll that out, we need to work with partners to make sure it's done in the right way. There's no one size fits all. You know that. Your viewers know that. We've done that for too long as a government, and we haven't worked with Indigenous partners, with provinces and territories. So we want to make sure that we're doing this in the right way. So negotiations, conversations are happening right now, and there will be funding attached to that, but we want to make sure that we're dealing with it. We're really happy Manitoba, for example, will be lifting their birth alerts. I mean, we have far too many children. It's tragic how many children are in foster care. So we have to do it, but we have to make sure we do it in the right way, and that we're not continuing to expose these children to situations where they're removed from their community, where I mean, we know that foster care is a pipeline into corrections. So on that one, we need to fix it, but we need to make sure that we fix it in the right way, and that's working with our partners. Do you want me to get into the second part, or do we have time?
Yes, sure. Why don't you?
So on the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, and I'm sure you've heard the minister speak in the House as well, that we are working to come up with a solution. We don't dispute that every child deserves to be compensated. Right now, there's a confidentiality in place between all the partners, so we're not going to breach that, but everyone has agreed, all parties have agreed to an extension to February 21st, and discussions continue on that.
Mr. Anand Sangari, along kind of a similar vein, how can you convince our audience that the government reflects Indigenous rights and is working towards self-government, getting rid of the Indian Act, when there's a conflict with resource development and extraction, what we're seeing in the news right now? It seems that that goes out the window, that this talk about reconciliation, what does it really mean?
Look, reconciliation is a long journey. It's not going to happen overnight. The pain and suffering and the indignity over the last 153 years cannot be erased over a 4-year mandate. But what is important is that we set the right framework in place. So, 4 years ago, you would have asked one person the same two questions. Now we have clear defined roles in terms of what Indigenous Services does, which is a shorter term piece, which is to ensure that the gaps are filled, that there's adequate and good services available that are in line with the provinces and with other jurisdictions. The role of Crown Indigenous Relations is a longer term piece, is to make sure that we look at it from 10, 15, 20 years down the line to say all the things that are important, all the things that will ensure that long-term vitality and strength of Indigenous communities are reflected in agreements that we establish, negotiated with the notion of self-determination as a center, with UNDRIP as a backdrop, and to make sure that we have a longer-term vision of where the relationship is going. you know, in the interim, there will be growing pains, and I think when we look at resources, for example, it's one of those issues where, you know, more predictability is coming down the pipeline. We have local benefit agreements that are in place, but of course, it's still an ongoing discussion and engagement, and to make sure that we get it right.
Just to stay with you, a new session is coming up. What is happening with the Indigenous rights framework?
Well, I think there are a number of things that are happening. So one of the major issues for us is obviously the work around UNDRIP. That is something that's in Minister Lemeny's mandate letter, and our minister will be supporting the implementation of UNDRIP and to make sure it's codified. So basically picking up from 262 as the baseline and to build on that. At the same time, we have a number of tables where recognition of rights is being discussed and coming forward. And I think we're in a point where many of the legislation that we have are being co-developed. So if you look at C91 and C92 have been co-developed, and I know even with UNDRIP, that's the way we're going. Obviously, that too is in its infancy, because this is the first time any government's done that. So obviously, it's going to the understanding of what core development means itself is being worked out. But I think we're making progress on all of these fronts.
Okay, well, we could obviously talk some more about this, but and I'm sure you will. You'll probably be back on the show in the future. But for now, I'd like to thank you for coming and talking to me today.
Thank you very much, Todd.
We'll have more after another short break. Welcome back. The overrepresentation of Indigenous people in federal prisons is a well-established fact, and it's one of the outcomes of previous federal governments getting tough on crime. One of those factors are mandatory minimum sentences judges must impose, especially for drug-related crimes. Earlier this week, Senator Kim Pate introduced Bill S-208. If passed, it gives judges more control over sentencing.
In fact, the criticism of the bill is that it doesn't go far enough, that it doesn't actually repeal the mandatory minimum penalties, and I accept that criticism. This is we should really have a sentencing or a law reform commission to do that work, but in the interim, there's no excuse to not implement this and allow judges discretion to not impose mandatory minimum penalties.
Pate says mandatory minimums have done little to reduce crime.
And in fact, if we want to be smart and tough on crime, we should be looking at more resources in the community to prevent people from being marginalized, victimized, and ultimately criminalized and imprisoned.
Pate's S-208 is actually a reintroduction of a previous bill, S-251. It died in the Senate during the last session due to a tactical error, which Pate says she's not making this time around.
I actually waited for almost 2 years to introduce it because it was part of the government platform, and because there seemed to be an impetus, and there was some indication, because it was in the mandate letters of the Minister of Justice, that it looked like, in fact, it was going to go somewhere. And so it's on me that I didn't introduce it right away. This time, however, it's not in the mandate letter. It's still an issue.
That's our show for this week. If you missed it, or want to check out a past one, go to our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamarand. Thanks for watching.